With question 78 of the Summa Theologia, we are continuing in the Treatise on Man. This is the fourth question on this treatise. There are many to come, and as you can tell by these first four questions, St. Thomas Aquinas right off the bat wants to talk about the soul. All right, because the soul is fundamentally important, because other than the soul, we have the matter or the body. And I like to say, as I mentioned in the last video, that when you take the soul out of a person, you have a corpse, and you don't have a whole lot left. So the soul is extremely important in regard to pretty much everything that we do other than being a corpse, right? And so initially he talked about the essence of the soul and then the union of the soul with the body. And then in the last question yesterday was about some of the general properties of the powers of the soul. And with question 78, now he's getting into the specific powers of the soul. This is really a lot of fun. There's only 4 articles, so this one will go relatively quickly. And so the first article says whether there are to be distinguished 5 genera of powers in the soul. Now, I already mentioned yesterday that you've got the nutritive or vegetative, you've got the sensitive, and you have the rational. Okay, so that's 3 of them, but there's 2 more that he is going to mention as the genera of the powers of the soul. Those 3 that I mentioned are the 3 types of souls that we see in living creatures like plants and animals and also human beings. And so when he comes to the genera of the powers of the soul, he says there are 5 genera of powers of the soul as above numbered. Okay, that was in one of the objections. Of these, 3 are called souls, and 4 are called modes of living. Okay, well, 3 plus 4 is 7, but there's some crossover there. The reason of this diversity lies in the various souls being distinguished according as the operation of the soul transcends the operation of the corporeal nature in various ways. Okay, so you've got the body, you've got the organs of the body. As we've talked about, there are certain parts, certain souls, or at least the rational soul, that transcends the bodily organ. Okay, the rational soul, the intellect, and the will happens outside of an organ. For the whole corporeal nature is subject to the soul and is related to it as its matter and instrument. There exists, therefore, an operation of the soul which so far exceeds the corporeal nature that it is not even performed by any corporeal organ, and such is the operation of the rational soul. Okay, so that's our first of the 5 genera. Below this, there is another operation of the soul which is indeed performed through a corporeal organ, but not through a corporeal quality, and this is the operation of the sensitive soul. Now, there's going to be an article in a couple from now that's going to talk about the specific parts of that sensitive soul, the 5 senses as we've come to know them. And then the lowest of the operations of the soul is that which is performed by a corporeal organ and by virtue of a corporeal quality. Such is the operation of the vegetative soul. For digestion, and what follows is caused instrumentally by the action of heat, as the philosopher says. So, as I mentioned yesterday, the vegetative or nutritive soul is what involuntary actions that happen within us, things like circulation of blood and the digestive system, the excretory system, that kind of thing, even the reproductive system, as we'll find out in just a moment. So let's see. In the soul, there is a power, the object of which is only the body that is united to that soul. The power of this genus is called vegetative, for the vegetative power acts only on the body to which the soul is united. All right? And then he goes on and says, for as much as the soul itself has an inclination and tendency to something extrinsic, and in this way, there are again, okay, so now I got ahead of myself. Okay, now he's going to talk about the other 2. So we have the vegetative, we have the sensitive, we have the rational, okay? So he says, for as much as the soul itself has an inclination and tendency to something extrinsic, and in this way, there are again 2 kinds of powers of the soul. The appetitive, in respect of which the soul is referred to something extrinsic as to an end. Okay, so this is when we desire something. Okay, this is going to be the sensitive appetite and also the will. The will, of course, has to do with the reason, but the will is also an appetite, as we will learn. Okay, which is first in the intention, the other is the locomotive power, in respect of which the soul is referred to something extrinsic as to the term of its operation and movement, for every animal is moved for the purpose of realizing its desires and intentions. Now, movement is really interesting. Remember that God was immutable. God did not move. God was perfect. And so when you think about it, anytime anything moves, it's trying to get to a place of greater perfection. Otherwise, you wouldn't move, right? Why would you move if you were already in a place of perfection? So movement always means desire for something better. Article 2, whether the parts of the vegetative soul are fittingly described as the nutritive, augmentative, and generative. So you think of the vegetative soul kind of like a plant. A plant has a vegetative soul, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Many people are very surprised by this. The vegetative part has 3 powers. For the vegetative part, as we have said, has for its object the body itself, living by the soul, for which body a triple operation of the soul is required. One is whereby it acquires existence, and to this is directed the generative power. Now, he's going to have more to say about the generative power in a moment. It's the highest, it's the most exalted. You might be able to guess why. Another is whereby the living body acquires its due quantity. To this is directed the augmentative power, okay, growth, okay. Another is whereby the body of a living thing is preserved in its existence and in due quantity, and this is directed to the nutritive power, and that's where it's eating, it's nourishing itself and that kind of thing, keeping itself alive. But the generative power has its effect not in one and the same body, but in another. Okay, so in the human being, the generative aspect requires 2 people, so it's not going to be something that you can just do on your own, for a thing cannot generate itself. Therefore, the generative power, in a way, approaches to the dignity of the sensitive soul, which has an operation extending to extrinsic things, although in a more excellent and more universal manner. For that which is higher in an inferior nature approaches to that which is lowest in the highest nature. So the generative is going to be the highest of the vegetative aspects or parts, which is kind of bumping up against the sensitive, which is higher than it, right? Therefore, of these 3 powers, the generative has the greater finality, nobility, and perfection, for it belongs to a thing which is already perfect to produce another like unto itself. Okay, regeneration. And remember, even in the Blessed Trinity, there was generation. You remember that, where the first person of the Blessed Trinity as paternity generates the Son, right? So you see this commonality between the creature and the Creator. And the generative power is served by the augmentative and nutritive powers, and the augmentative power by the nutritive. So there you go. Whether the 5 exterior senses are properly distinguished. Now, I show a picture of a pig here because the 5 senses are, we have them, of course, but also brute animals do. Okay, the pig is going to have all these senses that I'm going to talk about here, and what they are is sight, taste, smell, hearing, and touch. Okay, those are the 5 senses. You probably already knew those. And so he's talking about this thing called immutation, which has to do with change, or so immutation is kind of a new word for me. But he says immutation is of 2 kinds: one natural and the other spiritual. Natural immutation takes place by the form of the immuter being received according to its natural existence into the thing immuted. And he'll give some examples here in a moment. Right now, as heat is received into the thing heated. So, he's going to explain this. Whereas spiritual immutation takes place by the form of the immuter being received according to a spiritual mode of existence into the thing immuted, as the form of color is received into the pupil, which does not thereby become colored. Okay, so when you see a color, you don't become that, but he's going to make a distinction here. He says, in some senses, we find spiritual imitation only, as in sight, while in others, we find not only spiritual, but also natural imitation. What Thomas is doing here is he's ordering the senses. He's going to tell you which is the most spiritual, which is outside, like the corporeal, not the corporeal organ, because obviously you need eyes, but what rises above the corporeal the most, either on the part of object only or likewise in the part of the organ. On the part of the object, we find natural immutation. There's that word again, immutation, right? As to place in sound, which is the object of hearing, for sound is caused by percussion and commotion of air. And we find natural immutation by alteration in odor, which is the object of smelling. Never did you ever imagine that these senses that we just kind of take for granted, there's so much going on with them from a philosophical standpoint, right? On the part of an organ, natural imitation takes place in touch and taste. For the hand that touches something hot becomes hot, while the tongue is moistened by the humidity of the flavored morsel. But the organs of smelling and hearing are not affected by their respective operations by any natural imitation, unless indirectly. So now he's going to rank them. He already kind of has, but now he's going to say, now sight, which is without natural imitation, either in its organ or in its object, is the most spiritual, vision, and the most perfect, and the most universal of all the senses. After this comes hearing, and then smell, which requires a natural immutation on the part of the object, while locomotion is more perfect than and naturally prior to the motion of alteration, as the philosopher proves. Touch and taste are the most material of all, of the distinction of which we shall speak later. Hence it is that the three other senses are not exercised through a medium. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's the ranking. He's going to say sight, and then hearing, and then smelling, and then taste and touch are there at the bottom, right? Isn't that interesting? All right, article number 4 says whether the interior senses are suitably distinguished. Now, he's going to talk about 4 interior senses. Most people probably never even heard of these, but he says, as nature does not fail in necessary things, there must needs be many actions of the sensitive soul, as may suffice for the life of a perfect animal. These are really interesting. Now, I have memory there, so that's going to be one of them, right? Now, we must observe that for the life of a perfect animal, the animal should apprehend a thing not only at the actual time of sensation, but also when it is absent. So if I see a cat, I'm sensing it at that moment. But what he's saying here is that, what about when I'm not seeing the cat, but I still have a cat in my mind? That's what he's saying. Otherwise, since animal motion and action follow apprehension, an animal would not be moved to seek something absent, the contrary of which we may observe, specially in perfect animals, which are moved by progression, for they are moved towards something apprehended and absent. Therefore, I guess it would be kind of like a snake, moving around looking for a rat or a mouse, so it's almost like it has something in its mind that it remembers, or there's some imaginative aspect because it's kind of naturally going for something that's not present at the moment, right? Okay, therefore, an animal through the sensitive soul may not only receive the species of sensible things when it is actually affected by them, but it must also retain and preserve them. But the animal needs to seek or avoid certain things, not only because they are pleasing or otherwise to the senses, but on account of other advantages and uses or disadvantages, just as the sheep runs away when it sees a wolf, not on account of its color or shape, but as a natural enemy. So these are like instincts, survival instincts that animals have, that it knows when it sees a wolf, it doesn't have to experience a wolf over and over and over again for the first time. It has that memory like, whoa, these things are bad, or almost like an intuition, you might say. Thus, therefore, for the reception of sensible forms, the proper sense and the common sense are appointed. I've always heard common sense to mean kind of like all the senses together. Okay, they're kind of like together. Common sense to us today means something different, but Thomas didn't mean it the way we typically. But for the retention and preservation of these forms, the fantasy or imagination is appointed, which are the same for fantasy or imagination is as it were a storehouse of forms received through the senses. So if I were to say turtle right now, you have an image that just popped up in your mind of a turtle. I doubt there's a turtle in front of you right now. That's your fantasy. That's your imagination, right? Furthermore, for the apprehension of intentions which are not received through the senses, the estimative power is appointed, and for the preservation thereof, the memorative power, which is a storehouse of such like intentions, okay? I have a memory of my third grade teacher, a memory of, my first job. This is a storehouse there. Now we must observe that as to sensible forms, there is no difference between man and the other animals, for they are similarly immuted by the extrinsic sensible. So he's saying these are kind of similar between us and the brute animals. But there is a difference as to the above intentions, for other animals perceive these intentions only by some natural instinct, while man perceives them by means of coalition of ideas. Therefore, the power by which the other animals is called the natural estimative, in man it's called the cogitative. As to the memorative power, man has not only memory, as other animals have, of a sudden recollection of the past, but also reminiscence, by syllogistically, as it were, seeking for a recollection of the past by the application of individual intentions. So I can intentionally say, you know what, I'm going to think about my wedding day, or I'm going to think about, the first date I had with my wife. Animals don't do that. They don't purposely call them up. All right, so I think that's going to do it. So he says, basically, 4 interior powers of the sensitive part: the common sense, the imagination, the estimative, and the memorative powers of the soul. Okay, I know this one's been kind of long. I hope you're still watching. If you're not, then you don't hear me saying this. But we're going to start getting into other parts of the soul now. Tomorrow, the intellect, and then the will, and then the passions, and all kinds of great stuff. So there's free will, that kind of stuff. There's much more to come, but I'll go ahead and bring this one to a close. Thank you for watching. Thank you for journeying through the Summa with me, one question at a time. Be sure to put your comments and your questions, if you have any, down below. God bless you. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.